Opinions expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of Shaw Cable Systems or of the station. Through our access policy, we provide the opportunity for community groups and individuals to express their points of view.
Hi, I'm Zach Jeffries, and welcome to Saskatoon In Focus, the program where we talk to the people in and behind the headlines who are moving Saskatoon forward today. Today it's my pleasure to have Jordon Cooper on set, and Jordon is a community activist as well as a columnist in the Star Phoenix. Now, as of very recently, it's a pleasure to have you on the program, Jordon.
Good to be here.
So if anyone's actually caught your article, it's every Monday in the Star Phoenix now, they've seen that you have had a history now of talking about some of the issues in Saskatoon that maybe are a little bit not on the positive side. We have despite the fact that we have a very interesting growing city with a lot of prosperity, we do have other sides that need to be addressed. So tell me about how that article came about and what you've been talking about recently.
What I've been talking about is, I guess in any booming city, you're going to have, unfortunately, more and more people that are left behind. Rents go up, income often stays flat, especially on the low end of the economic spectrum. And unfortunately, it does cause some suffering. While a lot of us have boomed, have experienced a lot of, have made money from the boom, have seen prosperity happen, some people have just suffered tremendously. And just trying to talk a little bit about some of the bigger social issues, and not only just some of the social issues that we experience, but what are some ways that we can actually tackle them and make productive change within the city.
Now, you have a very unique perspective on this. This is not just an academic perspective on some of the problems in Saskatoon. You actually are involved day in and day out in the neighborhoods in Saskatoon that are most in need. Yeah,
well, I've called one of the core neighborhoods home. We've lived in Mayfair for 12 years now. I've worked at the Salvation Army now for going on 6 years. And, we see day in and day out, and it's not a typical cross-section of what makes Saskatoon. It's a cross-section of people that are struggling and are hurting, and that's why they are coming to the Salvation Army for help. And also, it's an experience of what's changing in some of the core neighborhoods, including my own neighborhoods. So it's an interesting, like I said, 15 blocks between home and work, and I see a lot as we as we live and work in that corridor there.
So you mentioned that with prosperity, sometimes people do get left behind. In your work and in your life, what are some of the biggest issues that you've seen facing Saskatoon?
Well, I think the first thing is just housing. 10 years ago, I had, or pardon me, 15 years ago, I was living in a place in City Park, a great apartment, a bachelor suite. I was able to pay my rent working on a lower income job while I was going to school, save up some money for school, go out to Seafood Sam's to watch the Riders play, live and make a car payment, and it was all very, very easy and livable. That apartment now would be completely unaffordable at the wage that I was making then. You wouldn't even be able to afford rent on what I was bringing home. So what we're seeing now is that people, a bigger percentage of what they're bringing home every day, it's just going just to make basic needs. They're having a hard time getting things like food or even living just any extras. The one thing that also, when you're living in such a disciplined environment just to make ends meet, a lot of studies have shown that, look, we have a finite amount of self-discipline, and so any mistakes are made, there's no margins to be able to help fix them. Good grief, even I blow money on that my wife sometimes think, what were you doing? And we've got the margins to be able to help live within that. It just adds up to, it's a harder and harder grind. It starts to take a toll on people, and they get to the point where they desperately need help.
So when we look at that, is that, I guess, the income disparity that's going on in Saskatoon and some of the other, you mentioned housing issues and making sure that people are having enough money to really have those necessities of life. In your experience, what is the answer? Because I know in people I've spoken with, it's not necessarily, well, let's just have more money for people on social assistance. It's really much more complicated than that.
Oh yeah, it is much more complicated. Giving more money in social services actually helps. In some ways, it creates another set of problems. You get social services rates are difficult to set because if you set them too low, people can't live in them. If you set too high, it becomes a disincentive to work. And also, as we've seen in the 90s especially, you saw an influx of people from one province to another on social services. That's not always the answer. What we see, I still see, and I can't believe it, guys that are my age that are completely illiterate. I know I tried to drop out of school from grade 5 to grade 9 or something like that every day, but yet I was constantly pushed out the door back to school to get the skills and the development that we needed, computer skills, reading, along there job training is learned and taught. And I think that's all part of it. Think that you could become illiterate in 2011 and get through a school system is a shame. And we've got to be able to figure out why that is both happening, but also why, how do we make the necessary improvements to get that back? David Karwacki, when he was Liberal leader, talked about 1,500 kids in Saskatoon being truant. When I talked to school board people and I talked to teachers, they thought that number was actually low. So here we are. We have another generation of children growing up without the basic skills that are going to be needed to make money. Other facts, if you look around demographically, if you look at what our population is race-wise, and you look at just working, the working people that work in Saskatoon are generally Caucasian. Why is it that a disproportionate amount of Aboriginals are not part of our workforce? And what do we have to do with that in terms of retraining and also perhaps even dealing with an underlying racism issue?
You actually touched on something really interesting, and that's education. I know you wrote an article a couple of weeks back here in the Star Phoenix, and you did touch on education as one of the key components of making some of these problems better in Saskatoon. When you look at the problems that we do have, whether kids not going to school, being truant, when we've got, like you say, a very high illiteracy rate. I was reading the other day that 40% of Canadian adults are actually functionally illiterate in a technological and fast-paced society. In your mind, what's the answer? Is this something that we as individual Saskatoonians can be of help in, or is this simply a government issue where we kind of have to let our politicians and bureaucrats take the reins on it?
Education at the start of it starts with stability. We moved from Calgary in '84, but I was in the Saskatoon school system. I had really one school change throughout the entire time, which meant teachers and principals that knew me, for good or for bad, throughout the system. What you have now is when you have instability within housing, you start to see just a transience that is having, where you got families moving around from different cities trying to make ends meet, from perhaps to go live in with in-laws and eventually the children start to be left further and further and further behind. One of the things you look at provinces and cities that have adopted a housing first approach to housing, which is we've got to get people into housing that they can afford and sustainable, is that it stabilizes the children. And it allows for an environment for not just the children, but also for the parents to go after the job training, to go after increased employment opportunities, because they're not so, and it moves them out of a survival mode where rent becomes everything.
So in your article yesterday in the Star Phoenix, it was on Monday, you mentioned that you've challenged the social services minister in Saskatchewan to ultimately live on what a social assistance recipient would receive, and you said that you would take that on as well. Is that actually a challenge that you're hoping that she takes you up on?
Well, in some ways, no, because there's not very much money there for anybody on social services to live on. But yes, I would do it. I think right now you're looking at a lot of people, even with the rental supplement, if they can get it, is not always enough to make ends meet. So you got people living out of their own personal allowance, which is set at around, anywhere from around $200 extra a month. So when you have that cut down to $150 or to $100, then you're expected to provide your meals, your food, your toiletries, your clothes on this incredibly small bit of money. Social service, I'm not saying for a second that saying social services rates is not incredibly hard, but when we say to those who are unemployable, and that's the rate for people who are unemployable, that to survive, you're going to have to go to the food bank, you're going to have to go to the Friendship Inn, you're going to have to go to coffee houses at the Salvation Army just to get the calories that you need to live on and rely on free clothes donations. Something is wrong. That's never been a part of who we are as Saskatchewan. And that's the important thing, is to realize that this is for people who are unemployable. This isn't just people who don't want to work or something else. The unemployable rate is for those that just cannot work. how are we going to treat those with enough dignity? So I'm a taxpayer as well, and I understand that, and I like to keep, and I hate to pay my taxes as much as anybody, or I grumble about them, but at the same time, I would, if we're going to ask for people to live on that rate, at least let's find a rate that is actually livable upon.
So we're actually running out of time here, but I wanted to briefly touch on a subject that is really current in Saskatoon. The police chief, Clive Wayhill, recently came out with, or is coming out with a report that's saying that with the issue of prostitution and escort services, that the municipality should look at actually doing some licensing and doing ID cards. Obviously, on one side, some folks would say that doing that really just encourages and legitimizes something that is kind of what we don't want happening in society here in Saskatoon. And on the other side, it says that at least would increase enforcement. As someone who sees what goes on in the sex trade, you mentioned, I believe on your blog recently, that you've actually seen the sex trade going on the street in front of your house. Quickly, is this a good idea or is this a bad idea?
No, it's a good idea. The increased enforcement to be able to make sure that these girls are not being trafficked. Well, I would hope that no one would be forced to perform sex acts for money. It is legal in Canada, but the important thing is to make sure that those girls are safe, are of legal age, and are not in there because they're being forced or coerced to do it. I hope society would come away that those women did not have to do it, but to protect those that are doing it, it may be the best step.
Great. Well, that's all the time that we have, Jordon. Thanks for joining us. I know that we have a lot of tough issues in Saskatoon that need facing, and I appreciate you coming in and chatting with us about them.
Thank you.
And that's all the time that we have for Saskatoon in Focus. I'm Zach Jeffries. Thanks so much for joining us. Please connect with us. Find us on Twitter, on Facebook, online, saskatooninfocus.ca, or send us an email, saskatooninfocus@gmail.com. We need your feedback because when we work together, we can make Saskatoon the best city in the world.